time. So, round of applause, please, for Klina.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having me, and thank you all for being here and caring about democracy and wanting to see a better kind of politics, which is so very desperately needed right now. You've just given some excellent stats about how votes are wasted and they count unequally. I think the top fact for me is that 68% of votes were wasted in the last general election. And that's an official term that means votes that go to losing candidates or candidates who won but above and beyond the number of votes that they needed to win. So they effectively just go on the scrap heap. In some countries, that's as few as 1% of votes get wasted. And vote, it translates differently in different languages. In some languages, it means to choose much more than it means in the English sense of vote. It's kind of like a lottery, really. And so we often talk about lottery elections, and that really feels like what's going on a lot of the time. So I'm Klina Jordan. I'm a co-founder and facilitator for Make Votes Matter, and that is the national campaign for proportional representation in the House of Commons. It's a single-issue campaign. We've just existed since the most disproportionate election ever, which you've talked about, in 2015. So we're very new, but we're very enthusiastic and pushing as hard as we can and have made some very good headway over the last few years. And you mentioned Labour not supporting PR, but a key part of our campaign is focused on converting them to PR, and there is hope in that area, which I'll talk more about later. It's worth mentioning that already we have all of the British opposition parties in our alliance for proportional representation, aside from Labour, but they are coming more and more on board, and we genuinely believe that we can get them on board. So we believe this is achievable in years rather than decades, but it does take some work to get there. So, as I said, thank you for your support for being here. Going just to reiterate one of your stats, UKIP got 3.9 million votes in 2015 and just one MP. And you now have more than twice as many votes as the DUP from the 2017 election, and yet they have 10 MPs and UKIP has none. And that definitely can't be right. You can't even hold the government to account if you don't have a representative parliament. And this is one of the greatest travesties of the current situation. If we really want to take back control, then we need to make sure Parliament genuinely represents the people. And it's only with real democracy that we can build the country that we want to live in. 67% of people independently polled in April said that last April said the share of votes a party wins should closely match the share of votes it receives. This is just the norm. Most people think this makes sense. It's kind of obvious. Why would it not be the case that you get the number of MPs proportional to the way that the people have voted? And of course, in most democracies, that is how it works. In 80% of democracies, they use proportional representation. Out of the OECD countries, the developed countries, you actually have 85% of them using proportional representation. First past the post, our crazy voting system, is actually only used almost exclusively in our country and ex-colonies. There are a couple other random ones like Azerbaijan, but if you look at the bulk of it, it's the UK, the USA, Australia also uses a stupid voting system which isn't proportional, but it's slightly better than ours. India also uses first past the post. Canada uses first past the post. They're desperately trying to get rid of it. So we are in the minority of democracies that use it still. So I've mentioned about the Make Votes Matter Alliance, which includes UKIP, the SNP, Plaid Cymru, the LibDems, the Greens, loads of Labour MPs, including the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, lots of other organisations and public figures, including the likes of Nigel Farage, but right across the spectrum. And equally importantly, we work with people like you who take individual action, and with local groups all over the country who are taking action to make votes fair. They run events, they run street stalls, meet their MPs, they get in the local press, and they have a real impact. A couple of the big things we did around that area last year was Hungry for Democracy in February, and that was on the anniversary of women first getting the vote. And we were saying it's 100 years since that happened, and we still have 68% of votes wasted. Isn't it time for the next step change to our democracy? And so we had lots of people going on fast for 24 hours, so it's just a symbolic fast. We got pretty hungry, but it's not going on hunger strike. But we had quite an impact in the media because we had some of our parliamentarian allies and others like Brian Eno participating in this as well. Another big thing we did in the summer, the government, in their wisdom, decided to have a democracy week. And we thought this was ridiculous. So we organised a Demand Democracy Day. And we had street stalls all over the country. I think it was 60 odd street stalls, with people getting signatures from their fellow townspeople for their local MPs, asking their local MPs to support PR. And those petitions are still available through our website. If you put in your postcode and sign it, then that will go to your local MP. So there's always actions like that you can take on the website, as well as kind of getting out on the streets, because that's maybe a step too far for some people. But you guys have all come here, so you're clearly active enough to do stuff like that.
We're going to get on the street in UKIP, it's not a problem.
Right. So, what else? Yeah, so I think the key thing about that is the only way that we will win this is if we do all take action. And we can do the kind of negotiating with the parties in Parliament, and that needs to happen too. You have to have that top-down leadership, but you have to have the demand from the grassroots, and in particular with Labour, which is the kind of keystone to making this happen. They are saying explicitly that they need to hear it from the grassroots. They need to hear it from people on the doorstep. And it doesn't seem to help that we say, well, 76% of your voters want PR. They actually want it to be a really live issue. So we need that kind of bubbling up all over the country, basically. Has anyone got a Labour MP in this room? Okay. Well, if you haven't, email them. Ask them to back PR. So in Stroud, you've got David Drew, so he does support PR, so you're in luck. Yeah. But yeah, that is one way to affect change.
Bristol West, are you?
Yeah, so we've got Dangham Debonair.
Yes.
Yeah, and she's now open to PR. Yeah, which is a move from not supporting PR.
Welcome. This is one of our younger members, Lee.
Hello.
Welcome, Lee.
Sorry, I was late.
Not at all. Just grab yourself a pew. This is Klina. We just started.
Okay, so as I was saying, if you go to the website, there's always actions you can take. They're often quite easy, like signing a petition or writing a letter to your MP, but there's also often fun things. So our homepage changes depending on what the top thing is. And at the moment, if you go there, you'll see an animation which is narrated by John Cleese. It's Make Votes Matter. So if you Google that, it will come up. It's makevotesmatter.org.uk, but if you just Google that.
You can also join as well.
Yeah.
It's fair to say. I mean, we're ecumenical. Diversity is what we believe in, so join up.
Yeah.
Because I think it's so important that we do get out and... This won't fall in our lap. We've got to go out and fight for it with other people, other parties.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Right, so I think the live issue of the day, which is worth mentioning, and I know I'm getting into dangerous territory here, the EU membership issue. In that referendum, every vote counted equally, and it should count equally every time. And we've had a whole load of Tory politicians saying things like everyone knew their vote counted equally in that, and yet they deny it the rest of the time. So we have to keep pushing this fact that needs to happen all of the time. And my perspective as well is that if we had had PR, we wouldn't be in the mess that we are now about Brexit. Everybody's voice needs to be heard. And if all the voices are heard and people can deliberate respectfully together, you can come to some kind of compromise. This is not what's happening in Parliament, and that means that they've failed spectacularly in coming up with anything that anyone wants. And we all need to talk with each other. I mean, I'm a member of the Green Party. There are other people from my organisation who have membership of all of the other parties, so we're truly cross-party in that respect.
Even the Conservatives?
Even the Conservatives. At our meeting today, we had 3 Conservatives. So it's our quarterly alliance meeting today in Parliament, which I've just come from. We need to listen to each other, and we need to find a middle way that everyone can live with. And it may not be perfect for most people, but at least we can find a way forward. So I would suggest that more democracy is the way of doing that. And I think deliberative processes are necessary as well. So we're obviously just advocating PR for the House of Commons, but the live issue of the day is Brexit, and we wouldn't be in the mess if we had PR. And to get out of that mess, we do need more democracy. So I know I've just trampled into a very tricky area, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about getting PR, the campaign generally, ideas that you've got for actions that we can take, and even the tricky issue of Brexit.
You can say what you want. I mean, we're not going to be upset, honestly, seriously. Please say what you think. Okay, well, the hands are coming up. Have you finished them?
Yep, that's my intro, that'll do.
Right, so, Alan.
People seem to imagine.
So the question is, can you explain some kinds of different types of PR?
Voting system, yeah. So our campaign is about the principle that seats should closely match votes. There are different systems that deliver that, and historically the electoral reform movement has been very much consumed with talking about the different system, which is the best system. I like the additional member system, I like the single transferable vote system, etc., etc. And what we believe is that that's detracted from the energy that needs to go into coordinating action to get the principle met. So what we've done over the last year in 2018 with our Alliance to Make Votes Matter is we've put together a document which was drawing on expertise from around the world. So huge amounts of research about voting systems, and there are swathes and swathes of political science studies about voting systems. And the short summary of that is that it all points to the fact that you get better outcomes with proportional systems. In terms of the types of system, there are all sorts of different ways you can do it, and the system that you would choose would probably be influenced by your values. And different people have different values, different parties have different values. So, for example, the Liberal Democrats would like the single transferable vote, STV, whereas Labour people tend to prefer, and this isn't in any way consistent across Labour electoral reformers, but a lot of them like the additional member system, or AMS. So we don't want to ever get into another situation, which has occurred in the past, where electoral reformers are split between systems, and then the first past the posters win the argument because they're using first past the post voting system to choose which the system would be. So our Good Systems Agreement has distilled all of this expertise from national consultations from Canada, from the UK, from Wales. There's recently been a big study in Wales, and come up with principles which we believe, and the Alliance now has agreed, and is fully rubber stamped by all these parties. These principles determine what a good voting system is. So the top of the list is proportionality. The rest of the list isn't ordered in terms of, we couldn't possibly say it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, because then everyone would disagree about which order they went in. Yeah. But everyone's agreed proportionality is at the top. But there are other factors within that, like accountability and diversity and local representation. And if you're using a list in the voting system, then it needs to be determined democratically. So that means that you've then got all of this alignment about the principle that seats match votes and what is a good voting system or a bad voting system. And then within that, everyone agrees that if there's an opportunity to choose any one of those voting systems that meets the principles, that they would support it. So we can actually be united and push together for the overall outcome that we want. So I haven't exactly answered your question in terms of how each system would work, but the answer to that is that there are many, many different ways that they can work. Basically, as many voting systems as humans can imagine can exist. And so there are endless permutations. The very short answer to the different voting systems is you either achieve proportionality by having local representation and a top-up from a list, or you have multiple member constituencies. And if you have single member constituencies, you can't achieve proportionality. So that's the two ways that splits the various voting systems. So I'm going to pick up on a couple of those. Some of them are going to outside my remit, and we can get into quite complicated areas about them. But in terms of constituency boundaries, if you have proportional representation, the boundaries matter far less. So you, as we were talking about with this top-up system, like they use in Germany, it's also the one used in New Zealand. It's also used multiple other places like the London Assembly. The top-up ensures that it balances out across the country or the voting area. So it doesn't matter if one constituency has 10,000 people and another one has 100,000 people. I mean, normally that's not how it would work, but what it means is that under PR, you can have constituency boundaries which are more in relation to genuine communities rather than a cutting across them, because you get all sorts of weird situations where they get cut across. Right, and in terms of reforming the boundaries, you, as I was saying, you can't have single member constituencies which result in proportional representation. So yes, if we're stuck with a system with single member representation, it would be better to have more fair boundaries. But there are all sorts of complications within this. So for example, at the moment, the Tories want to change the boundaries to be more equal in size. And Labour doesn't, because Labour has these huge stacks of votes in cities where they count for nothing. So actually, the way their vote works out in the end, kind of because of the flukes of first past the post, they end up with closer to what proportionally they should have. And in fact, in the last election, they actually got a proportional result, which was very unusual. Whereas if they switch to the new boundaries that are being proposed, then if Labour and the Tories, I might get the numbers slightly wrong, but if Labour and the Tories both got 38% of the vote, then, no, I'm not going to remember the numbers, but the Tories would get some huge number of MPs more than Labour. I can't remember what that number is, but basically it skews it to one side or another, depending on how you sort the boundaries out. And obviously, if that's done intentionally, it's gerrymandering, and we have an independent commission that does that in the UK, but you were talking about whether that's independent or not. So, yeah, get rid of the single member constituency issue, and the whole thing gets a lot easier.
But there is gerrymandering.
Just to kind of go back to your points, and just to be really clear, with proportional representation, you largely do away with gerrymandering. So that's the thing to remember about that. And then you were asking about the turnout for the referendum, which was far higher than general elections usually is. Yeah, their vote counted, yes. Well, also, had they had first past the post, he would have been elected a lot sooner. And the thing is with first past the post is a minority can take complete control. So I think it was in 2015 the Tory government had 37% of the vote. So it's much easier to seize control of the whole country or the area that's being governed with first past the post than it is with proportional representation.
I think it's a very good point, because, again, from a UKIP point of view, I appreciate you're not UKIP, but people say, 52% is not really a majority and it's not overwhelming and all this. Actually, David Cameron became Prime Minister on the basis of 36% of the votes, and nobody was saying, that's a minority rather than a majority, and no one said a dicky bird about that, basically. So, and here we are, from a UKIP point of view, 52% was a clear majority. It was a clear question. Whether a binary question should have been asked or not is a different matter, but it was a clear majority, and David Cameron said he would act upon that. And here we are 2.5 years later in the mire that we're in. And the reason, what I do agree with Klina, is the reason is because the House of Commons does not reflect the popular vote or what the people want. And that's where we are. And I think probably now there's a great opportunity for Make Votes Matter and to say, look, to use the Brexit impasse to say, we are not, this is what happens when you have a general election that doesn't reflect what people voted for, because, the LibDems are represented, they've got 11, but they're not proportionately represented. The Greens are totally underrepresented, sorry, UKIP is certainly underrepresented, and other parties, Labour, I think Labour is still overrepresented. I don't think it was proportional.
No,
last time.
the last election it was proportional,
I
basically.
thought it was slightly over.
It might have been a tiny
Yeah,
bit. It was
yeah.
basically
Couple of percent over, I think.
proportional.
The Tories are massively overrepresented. The DUP is massively overrepresented. The SNP is massively overrepresented. And although I'm not an SNP fan, to be fair, they're still in favour of PR, even though they were massively
Very much so.
overrepresented. So I think, I can't see how any of smaller party can progress until we can fix the big problem.
Yeah, so there are a lot of very compelling arguments for the voting age to be lowered, and again, that's not something Make Votes Matter takes a position on. I personally think it should be lowered. I'm sure there's a whole range of opinions even in this room.
Scottish referendum was lower, wasn't it?
Yeah. If do have a read up about some of that. I'd say to look at the Electoral Reform Society's website, because they campaign for that, so they've got a lot of information there if you'd like to know more. So there was a vote on the alternative vote, and the alternative vote is not a proportional system, and that was a consequence of a compromise between the LibDems and the Tories and the coalition. So nobody, or very, very few people, really wanted the alternative vote, and it lost spectacularly. Turnout was tiny, and I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think it was something like 2/3 to stay with the status quo and 1/3 to change to a new voting system. Please don't quote me on that. I wasn't involved in that referendum, but really it wasn't the right choice to be offering. So it's really about the principle that seats match votes. So if a party gets 20% of the vote, they should get about 20% of the seats, as close as possible. So if we're talking about elections to the House of Commons, it would be the national vote. So some systems use a transferable vote. So the single transferable vote system is one of those. The alternative vote is another one of those. So it's about meeting certain thresholds, and it depends how many representatives there are per constituency. So it's basically called a magic number. So you work out a number based on the number of representatives there are to be in a constituency, and then you eliminate people who don't win enough votes, and their votes, that the second votes for those people get passed to the second choice. So if a voter has voted 1 blue and 2 green, and blue is knocked out in the first round, then their votes would be transferred to green in the second round, if that makes sense. So with the alternative vote, it's the same system, basically, but the difference is you end up with 1 representative, whereas with the single transferable vote, you can have multiple representatives. And as I was saying, if you just have 1 member per constituency, you can't have a proportional outcome. Yeah, so DANT is a way of counting within systems, so it's used in different systems, yeah. In terms of the undemocratic lists, it's worth pointing out that the current situation is that the parties quite often undemocratically, some parties do it democratically, but some of them do it undemocratically, determine lists of 1. So it's exactly that, but you only get 1. So it's even less choice for the voter. As I was saying about our good systems agreement, part of that really clearly says that if lists are to be used, they must be determined democratically. So for us, that means that either everyone who's voting gets to choose the sequence of the people on the list, which has its advantages in meaning that it's as open as possible. It can also make it quite complicated. So to make it less complicated for the voter, another way of doing it is if the party membership determines the sequence of the list. And so there would be a vote to choose the list within each party before there would be a general election. So it can be done entirely democratically, and we wouldn't accept any system that didn't do it in some democratic way. So that can be dealt with entirely. In terms of coalitions and the smoke-filled rooms at that end of the spectrum, yes, proportional representation results in more coalitions. Coalitions is a dirty word in the UK, but actually what it means is a compromise, consensus, collaboration. It's actually people getting together, discussing things democratically and agreeing between themselves how that they can best meet all of their voters' preferences. So, for example, in New Zealand now, you've got a coalition of the equivalent of Labour, UKIP and the Greens, and it's working pretty well. and they represent a majority of the voters. And yes, those deals in some countries are done behind closed doors, which I would say isn't the right way to do it. But in some countries, they declare in advance which parties they would be willing to go into coalition with. So when you vote, you know exactly what you're going to get, depending on the percentages of the outcomes. So it isn't some surprise at the end of the day when you suddenly see, the Green Party's jumped into government with the Purple Party, or whatever it might be. Well, I think healthy disagreement is absolutely brilliant and necessary. Opposition and fighting each other is not healthy. And we have an oppositional system. Parliament is set up to be two swords lengths apart. And I always hated politics growing up, because to me it was two groups of blokes shouting at each other. And to me that isn't a good way to get things done. And a lot of other parliaments, if you look at modern parliaments, they're generally circular. It's not this fighty us against them kind of situation. And our voting system, first past the post, gives a false advantage to two big parties. And at the moment, for a long time, that's been Tories and Labour. And that means that you've got two gangs fighting each other. And you watch Question Time, PMQs. And that isn't necessarily the best illustration of how Parliament is, because it is kind of, it's more theatrics, and it is just like playground bullying, the kind of noises that you hear. But to me, that's not a way to figure out how to run a country. And I think the big problem with the whole Brexit situation is that we're not having real deliberative dialogue between people who are initially on the different sides of the spectrum, but if they talk to each other, they would find commonality, and they would figure out bits they do agree on, bits they don't agree on, and then you can find ways forward on the bits that you do agree on. I'm not sure he was ever in favour of PR. He's always said he's open to PR, right. But my impression is he's not enthusiastic about PR. So, I mean, this is the kind of the typical answer from a politician who doesn't feel really strongly one way or the other, that they leave it open so that people aren't going to not vote for them because they're on one side of the spectrum. I don't know exactly what's going on with Jeremy Corbyn. I think he is genuinely open, but who knows? But I think with
by his party, perhaps.
Well, so there are now I can't remember the exact number, but it's well over 80 Labour MPs who officially support PR. We've had 53 constituency Labour parties pass motions for PR. This time last year we were aiming to get 35 by now, so it's going really well.
It can practically only be done with Labour support, can't it? That's
yes, but the building blocks of democracy within the Labour Party, theoretically, are the CLPs. And the CLPs, when you go and talk to them and you rebut the myths, then they actually want PR. So it is a matter of time rather than whether it's going to happen. So nobody's proposing that. I'm fully in support of healthy debate. What I'm against is simplifying something to a binary matter which isn't genuinely binary. Most things to do with humans aren't binary. We're not zeros and ones. Like obviously with computer coding, if you have enough zeros and ones in chains, then you can figure out all sorts of complicated things. But the reality is, and you mentioned Brexit isn't black and white. It's not yes and no. It's not in and out. There are multiple ways one can be in or out. And that wasn't figured out to be put on the ballot before the referendum. And so my perspective is, so people are campaigning for another referendum. For me, if there was another referendum with another yes or no, in or out binary choice, it would be disastrous, because you just would exacerbate that division, and you wouldn't actually do anything to bring people together to discuss the issues and come to any kind of consensus. So this isn't about being fluffy or quelling people's voices who have a different opinion to you. It's actually about hearing those voices, and you can be passionate and you can say, no, I really disagree about that thing, but you listen to each other, and as I said, it's about finding the areas of commonality. And I'm agreeing in a room with UKIP people, and we agree that we need more democracy, and I think normally there are ways where we can find commonality? Well, no. So we already have a multi-party system, but our voting system doesn't reflect that. So we already are voting for lots of different parties. There was a change in the 2017 election because there was a huge surge of tactical voting, and a lot of that was to do with Brexit. A lot of it was about trying to keep the Tories out. So there was a National Progressive Alliance movement, which was about trying to stop the Tory landslide. And indeed, the Tories lost their majority. But actually, the original impetus for that came from the Greens, who were trying to lead on changing the voting system. But the messaging got lost along the way, and it became this thing about keeping Tories out, whereas it was meant to be, if someone else is better placed than you to win, who will support a change to a proportional voting system. And in the case of the Greens, obviously, they would only do that for someone with progressive values as well. Then stand aside so that that person can win, but not to stand aside unless there was a commitment to changing the voting system. And that's not going to happen again. So in the last election, 20 to 30% of people voted tactically. And the Labour Party totally isn't recognising this. And I think they think that they could win an election. Maybe they don't, because they haven't pushed that hard to get an election. They've made a kind of symbolic thing about trying to get an election. They will not get that Progressive Alliance support in the same way again, because the Greens aren't going to do it, lots of other parties aren't going to do it. Yeah, and that's part of the problem. What is progressive? Like, everyone has a different idea of what is progressive.
But also, it's quite interesting because on the other side of the coin, if you like, lots of, for example, Gloucester's a very good example, lots of UKIP people in Gloucester voted Conservative last time because they thought that the Conservatives would deliver Brexit. So they lent their vote to the Conservatives. So actually, and that won't happen again because they won't trust the Conservatives again. So it's quite interesting because so that whole business of lending votes, you get stung once, and like the Greens did, or UKIP voters have done, or Brexiteer voters have, but the Conservatives now had sufficient numbers of Green voters not lent their vote to the Conservative MP here, we probably would have had a Labour MP in Gloucester as well. So it's quite interesting the way the whole thing pans out. But Martin, your thing about it's going to be more touchy-feely in a circular parliament, and we won't have this sort of adversarial thing. Because I'm interested in politics and I'm interested in learning German, I've been watching the Bundestag debates on YouTube, and it's quite interesting. They've had exclusion of the AfD, they've had exclusion of the Linke, which is the left-wing party within the... So there is passionate debate in these proportional assemblies. It's not a question of everybody suddenly becomes a tree hugger and doesn't have a viewpoint. There is passionate debates there's a considerable passionate debate in those assemblies, and I'm sure that's not just in Germany, it's in other countries as well.
So we're a single issue campaign for PR for the House of Commons, but of course we would like to see PR in general in the UK and generally around the world. So we're supportive of people who are trying to get it for local government. We've put some support towards, in Wales, they're trying to make their system for the Assembly more proportional, and they have a form of somewhat proportional representation there, but it's not that proportional. So when we were talking about top-up lists before, in Scotland, they have a top-up for Holyrood, which actually means that they get a proportional outcome. And in Wales, with the same system, they have fewer assembly members on the top-up, so you don't get a proportional outcome. It's better than first past the post, but it needs to be improved. And so they've had this report recommending more proportionality there, and we've put some effort into supporting that move. It's not currently looking that hopeful, and that's to do with Labour not yet being on board about it. But we would obviously like to see it elsewhere, but that's not what we actively work on.
Okay, thanks, I've remembered you said.
Good. So we want to get Labour on board, and then we would like to see a majority of pro-PR MPs elected from whatever party, so that they then have the mandate to legislate for proportional representation. We would like the way for that to work is for a citizens' assembly to be commissioned for the people to choose the voting system in a deliberative process, and then either for Parliament to vote on that, or it could be put to a referendum. But there have been problems with referendums in this country recently, questions about how democratic they've been, about influence of foreign powers, of money, etc. So we need to get much better at doing referendums. I personally think referendums, when done well, are great, but we definitely need to improve the way we do them. Yeah. And I believe that there are studies around this about accountability and transparency linked with different voting systems. And I can't claim to know the details of those off the top of my head. But if you were interested to know more about them, I could look them up for you. Yeah.
Any more questions, anyone? Well, I'd like to say thank you so much to Klina for coming here to Gloucester. It's a horrible January dark night. And I hadn't realised you've been in London today as well. So that's really kind of you and good of you. Thank you so much. And I think it's only by, I suspect I don't agree with Klina on very much politically. I don't know.
You never know.
I don't think it's a surprise. I don't think that's a secret. We may be pleasantly surprised, but I don't think it's. But what's really good is that people with such opposing views can work together for an aim to benefit everyone in a constructive fashion and in a positive fashion to benefit our whole country, because this country is broken by the Conservative and Labour parties currently, and something needs to change, because otherwise what will happen is people won't vote, they'll take to the streets or whatever else. So I'm happy to I'm happy to embrace the Greens, the LibDems or the Scottish National Party, whoever it may happen to be, for the same common aim, although I don't agree with hardly anything that any of them say. And there's no perfect system. Let's not forget, this isn't the panacea that cures all. There's no perfect system. But the current system that we have was introduced in the 19th century, 150 years ago. What other thing else are we using currently in the same format that we had in the 19th century? And I struggle to think of anything. And, for my children who are now grown up, who vote, I think, what future is there for our children, our grandchildren in this country with this current broken system, which is basically working for the benefit of two interests, which is, in the case of the Conservative Party, big business fundamentally, and in the case of the Labour Party, organised labour. There is far more within this country than that, and I think we all have, if Klina and myself and other people from diverse parties can work together to achieve a fairer system to represent the people of this country, I think that's a bloody good show. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.